Okay, without further ado, I want to introduce you guys to our keynote speaker, Jeenna Canche. And she currently serves as a World Language Specialist at the Hawaii Department of Education after more than a decade of teaching high school Spanish at a public school in Maui. And her passion lies in sharing the how and the why of language acquisition with educators and coaching teachers in using communicative input-based strategies and approaches. Jeenna is one of the most passionate teachers I've ever met. We first met when she came to my school to observe my class and gave me valuable feedback. And I'm very excited that she's here to share her expertise and experience with us as this year's keynote speaker. And during her speech, you can take notes. If you just open your program. Over here, page 4. We have notes, key concepts that you can jot down. And in this lesson I learned, I still want to know, and I'm going to try. So you can go ahead and take notes in here if you wish. And that's all. All right, let's welcome Jeenna Canche.
All right, aloha everybody. So my first question is, can you hear me okay if I don't use the microphone?
Yes.
Yeah, everyone's good. Okay, good. I don't want to be tied to the microphone. Thank you very much for coming today. I'm really excited to have you here. And I am really excited to be here. I'm very humbled to be asked to speak. It's been a very interesting journey to get from where I started back in 2006 to where I am today. We talked, when we first started planning for this conference, we talked a lot about like what would be the theme and what would be the idea. And one of the things that we talked about is how as we all progress to this style of teaching and the things that we're going to be sharing with you today and tomorrow, it was really taking a big step outside of our comfort zones. And so I was like, well, I think I'm going to talk about stepping outside of your comfort zone. And then we started talking about, well, when you do that, sometimes, it's a big change in the way you're thinking, and it takes just trying one thing. And so we came up with this theme, try one thing, stepping outside of your comfort zone. And I chose this picture. This is a picture of my son, Jeremy, who you guys probably saw out front. He was helping out. And he was jumping off the cliff in Maui, and he's definitely very inspirational for me because he's always willing to do things that are outside of his comfort zone. So it's inspirational for me to look at that and say, I can do things too. I won't be jumping off the cliff anyway, but I can do a lot of things that are outside of my comfort zone. So anyway, okay. So before we get into the speech or the presentation that I'm going to do, I want you to really be thinking about what your goal is for your learners. So to kind of get that mindset going, I would like you to head to www.menti.com, and we're going to put in this access code, and then we're just going to kind of see what the main goal is for the people in this room when you think about your learners. So if we look according to our slide up here, it looks like communication and confidence are the two biggest goals that we have in this room. So just keep in mind, be thinking about that goal as we continue throughout. And now I gotta get back. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my story. So I started teaching in 2006 at Kincaid High School in Maui. I lived on Maui for about 16 years, so I lived there for a little while before I started teaching. And then after that, I was there for 6 years, and then I started teaching at Maui High School, and I was there for another 5 years, during which time I actually also taught part-time at Kincaid Charter. There was 4 years after school between these two schools while I was teaching at both schools. So I got a little bit of experience with teaching, not just face-to-face, but I did kind of a blended and virtual format. And so that's kind of just a little bit of the background of my teaching experience. I also want to share, I've talked about this with a few of you here before at different professional development sessions that I've done, but I want to share that I was not like a typical person coming into teaching. I came into teaching as an emergency hire. So when I got hired, it was like 2 weeks after school had started, and there was an ad in the newspaper looking for a Spanish teacher, and I was like, wow, they must really need somebody. And I wasn't fully qualified to teach yet. I had a bachelor's degree and I spoke Spanish. And those were my qualifications, basically. So I went up and I interviewed for this position. I think what the most exciting part about this is that I really wanted to teach Spanish. I was so excited. I was like, oh my gosh, this is my opportunity. I'm going to have this chance to finally be able to, do what I've dreamt of doing for so long. I went up, I interviewed for the position. They said something in the interview like, oh yeah, we have more people to interview. I left the interview, got back down the hill, because it's up the hill from where I lived, and got back down the hill, and I got a phone call and was hired. So obviously they didn't have anybody else. But anyway, but I think that they knew that they could see that I was very passionate and excited about wanting to teach. We all come into teaching in different ways. That was my beginning. So from there, this is my first day. Okay, so I was so excited. You can see I had a great big smile on my face. And I just want to say, if you haven't created a Bitmoji for yourself, I spent hours on this yesterday at the advice of somebody else in our group. I know it's very fun, so hopefully you'll appreciate it because I spent a lot of time on it. But anyway, so this is my first day. I was so excited. I went in with like the most idealistic thinking about this is going to be great. All these kids are going to be learning Spanish, and I'm going to be the one that's getting them to get to that point. So this was the next 2 years. Okay, so I actually started my master's program within a couple of months, and then I was taking everything I was learning in my master's program and applying it to my teaching. It was a master's in education. It wasn't a master's in teaching language. Because I was on Maui, I had to do it online. I didn't have any options really. But I was following everything that I thought I knew about language teaching. I had my textbooks. I was reading all the information that I needed to learn to be able to teach from this textbook and do everything just right. So I was teaching students how to conjugate verbs. I was teaching them about endings. I was teaching them about sentence structure, and I was doing all of this hard work with so much enthusiasm. And those are my students. So I was still excited, but I was starting to feel a little bit frustrated because I would get to the end of the year and I would ask my students a question like, ¿Cómo estás? And these are the kinds of questions I ask. I knew that there had to be some other way. Like, this just wasn't working. It wasn't working for me. It wasn't working for my students. And I was putting in a lot of work. It wasn't like I was just doing nothing, right? So I had to really think about this and figure out something else. Yeah. So I started on a journey. I started, actually I was reading books, but I went online, of course, but back then there wasn't as much available, but there was still some. And I just started to really look at, okay, what can I do? What can I do that's different? What is out there? What do I need to change? Because I wanted my students to be able to speak. My goal for them was communication, but they weren't getting to that communication. And so after several months of really researching and finding out some different ways, I found this book. And this is actually, it wasn't even this edition, it was probably like, I think this is the 7th edition, it was probably like 2nd edition, or something like that at the time. But it was a book about TPRS, and I didn't know anything about TPRS, I had no idea what it was. You're going to be going through a session tomorrow on TPRS with Nan and Reed. But I didn't know anything about it, but I was so wanting to figure out something that would work that I started reading this book, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is really different, but maybe this could work. And so I spent so much time just okay, I'm going to figure this out, I'm going to do this thing, but it was really far outside of my comfort zone. I mean, it was like, not like, oh, I'm just going to go add this strategy to what I'm already doing. It was like, let's go from this box all the way over here to this box. It was totally, totally different. And so I remember the day that I did my first TPRS lesson. I had been spending several evenings preparing this document, and you'll kind of understand more if you don't know about TPRS. You'll kind of understand more when you attend Read It non-session. But I wrote out a script. It was like 7 or 8 pages long of every question with every answer that I was expecting to get from my students. I wrote it all out. I had it all typed out, printed it out, got in my car that morning, drove to school, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this with my Spanish 3 students. And it was right after recess. And I had like butterflies in my stomach. I mean, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, right? And so as I'm driving down, I'm like, okay, I'm going to be able to do this, I can do this, I can do this. And I got to school, got through my first class, recess came, I talked myself out of it. I was like, I can't do it. So being the really good teacher that I've been, I quickly prepared a lesson out of the book, right? Got the textbook, rearranged everything. And then the bell from recess rang, and the first student walked through the door, and I really wish I could remember his name, but I don't remember his name. And he was kind of a goofy kid, and he walked in, he's like, Miss, can we just do something different today? And I just chuckled, because I was like, well, actually, we can. So I had to stop and say, okay, I'm going to do this. Yeah, I had to regroup. And so all the students came in, and I shared with the students, and I said, okay, we're going to try something different today. This is brand new for me, so you gotta bear with me. We're gonna just try and get through this. And I did it. Yeah, I did this story with my students, and my jaw was on the floor. At the end of the class, every student in that class could retell that story, and I couldn't believe it, because these are students who basically, all they could do was conjugate verbs, right? So I was really, really amazed, and so I was so excited, and I wanted to, share everything that I had been learning with everybody, the whole world. I was like, I wanted to go to the rooftops and be like, you gotta check this out. This is like a miracle, right? And so I basically went from this grammar-based approach all the way to this other fishbowl, yeah, and it really was. It was like going from a rock to magical land, and I did it for a while. But here's what happened. Here's what happened. So I did this for a while. I shared with everybody in my department. I was super, super excited, and the Spanish teachers were like, the other Spanish teacher and the French teacher were like, let's try this, let's check it out. And the Japanese teachers were like, well, I don't know if this is going to work for Japanese. And I didn't really know why it worked, right? I just knew that it really worked for me and my class. And so I ordered a bunch of books, and Blaine Ray, so if you don't know who Blaine Ray is, he's actually the person who invented TPRS. Blaine Ray called me, and I was like, whoa, hi. And I was like, so I'm going to be on Maui. My daughter lives there. I'm going to be there. Do you want me to come teach in your classroom? And I'm like, yeah. So he came and he taught in my classroom, and then we arranged to do a professional development for the teachers on Maui. He did it for free. He didn't charge us anything. He came up to the school. I arranged everything. He came up to the school, and then that's when I encountered the first kind of resistance. Yeah, it was when we did that PD, and it wasn't bad, but it was just somebody asked him this question, and I didn't think he had a very good answer. Someone asked him, well, what about grammar? And his answer to that person was, well, kids don't want to learn grammar. Do you really know any kids that want to learn grammar? And this woman, she happened to be a student at the college. And she said, well, I really like learning grammar. and I was kind of left there like, oh, well, what about grammar? Yeah, I started to think like, am I doing something wrong? But as I progressed, I would kind of went back to the textbook a little bit, and then it wasn't working. So then I went back to TPRS, and then it worked. And I kind of did this little flip-flop back and forth. And because I didn't have a good answer for that, I was scared to really share anymore what I was doing. So this was me in my classroom. For the next probably 4 or 5 years, yeah. And I just continued doing what worked for me, but I wasn't really sharing. Then in 2016, Southwest CULT came to Hawaii. Yeah, how many of you guys got to go to Southwest CULT? Okay, so let me just, in case people don't know, I just want to make sure everybody knows. So this is part of HALT, which is Hawaii Association of Language Teachers, which if you weren't a member before, you're now a member. And Southwest COLT is the Southwest Conference on Language Teaching. So it's our regional group for language teachers. So Southwest COLT came to Hawaii, and I had made like a deal with myself. I had made like a promise to myself that I was going to start getting more involved. And so I volunteered to come and be part of HALT that year. And so I just came as a volunteer, and I got to attend Southwest COLT. And so much to my amazement, I started to realize at that conference, oh my gosh, what I'm doing is actually becoming more mainstream. It's actually not, I started to realize like, this isn't like this closet thing anymore that people just do and hide behind, the curtain. It's actually something that people are doing more. And when I say, this thing, I'm not just referring to TPRS, that's where I started, but I'm really referring to the bigger picture, which is comprehensible input. So I was super, super excited after that conference, and I went home and spent about, $300 on Amazon, and bought tons of books. I started participating with ACTFL, which, for those of you who don't know, ACTFL is the American Council, is it Council? Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. So that's our national organization. I started becoming involved. I started participating in special interest groups online and commenting and reading what was going on. And I started to realize after a little bit that this guy kept popping up a lot. So if you guys don't know who this is Bill Van Patten. He is Professor Emeritus at Michigan State University, and I don't even know where to start with him. He's done so much. He's written textbooks, he's written other books, he's very, very good at sharing about language teaching with teachers. Yeah, so even though he's university level, he doesn't have that disconnect, I think, that a lot of times happens. He also had this podcast called Tea with BBP. And so I started listening to that podcast. I found out about it when I was doing the special interest group through ACTFL. And I started listening to this podcast, and I started learning about communicative language teaching. And I didn't really know what it was. If someone had asked me at that time, like, oh, do you use communicative language teaching? I would have been like, oh yeah, my students talk all the time, right? But as I started to read and research and understand more about how second languages are acquired, I started to realize that I didn't really know what it was. I thought I knew, and but I really didn't. But I learned, yeah. I spent that year really learning. This book wasn't out at that time, but since then, ACTFL has published a book that he wrote called While We're on the Topic. This is probably the best book to start with if you don't know anything about it. This is written for teachers, very friendly, and it brings you through pretty much everything that I had to go through, spend $300 on all those other books. It brings you through all of that in a really easy to understand way. So here were my takeaways. So after I spent probably about a year doing all this research, and here are my biggest takeaways that I learned about second language acquisition, the research and the theory. So the first thing I learned is that language is too complex to be taught explicitly. So when I thought back to my experiences when I was using that textbook and I was teaching all that grammar and stuff, I started to realize, like, well, yeah, the students could learn that, but that didn't lead to the language getting into their heads, because language is so completely more complex than we already think it is. So that was one big takeaway. Another one is that learning a second language is very, very similar, much more similar to learning a first language than it is different. There are differences, obviously. They already have a first language. They have, other skills and things that they know. But it's much more similar than different. So I had to really adjust my thinking and start to think about when I was teaching my students that I was really teaching 2-year-olds or 1-year-olds, and really think about it in that way. And that helped me a lot to be able to understand that. And understand that this was research-based, because remember, before I couldn't defend anything I was doing because I didn't know the why. The next thing is that input and interaction are essential ingredients for acquisition. We're going to talk a little bit more about acquisition in a little bit, but that input and interaction, those first couple years in my classes, my students didn't get input. They were really lucky if I even spoke Spanish by the end of the year. Because, you know, if I was speaking Spanish at the end of the year, it was like a good day, because I was so busy teaching them about the language. So that was pretty much absent those first couple years. And then the last thing on here is that in order for students to acquire language, the goal has to be communication. And I thought that my goal was communication, but because I didn't understand what that really meant, I wasn't really teaching to my goal until I started using these other strategies. So there are definitely more, there's a lot more to second language acquisition than just this, but these were my big takeaways and the things that I feel really help inform what I do and what I continue to do after that. And all of these basically make up the principles of communicative language teaching with a few additions. All right, so back to Bill Dunn Patton. So one thing he always says is that if you say you teach communicatively, then you better have a definition of communication. And I thought I knew what communication was. I was like, yeah, I'm a teacher. That's what we do, right? But I didn't really know until I actually started to study about it. So I want you to just take a moment, turn to somebody next to you, and just talk about what is communication. And I know a lot of you in here should be able to say what it is, so let's see if you can remember, okay? So I'll give you a couple minutes to talk about communication. What is it? All right. Anyone want to volunteer? Anybody that either knows the actual definition or just wants to talk about what you talked about? Yeah.
It has to be meaningful and purposeful.
Meaningful and purposeful is super, super important, yeah, absolutely. Meaning is part of the definition of communication. Meaning is in there, very, very big part of it, absolutely. Anybody else? Oh my God. Anybody remember from past PDs what the
Expression and the interpretation and negotiation of meaning.
And a given, oh sorry, no, I was looking at notes. So this definition of communication is very widely accepted in the language teaching world. And this definition of communication really helped me change a lot of the things I was doing in the classroom to make them better. Just as Kehab said, the expression, interpretation, and negotiation of meaning in a given context. But it's really important that we break this down because just like that, it's not enough. You really need to really wrap your brain around this. So we're going to go through this and we're going to break it down and make sure that everybody's on the same page. So first conversation, talk to your partner. What are we talking about when we say communication is the expression of meaning? So. Expression of meaning, what are we talking about? You can just shout it out.
Speaking.
Speaking and writing, yeah. So basically the expression is the output part, right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about expression. If it's sign language, it would be signing. Yeah, so expression of meaning, the output part. Okay, excellent. All right, next one. Quick conversation. What about the interpretation of meaning? What are we talking about there? Go. Just a quick
Or interpreting. It's brain.
What none of this provides yet is which language or what resource you're using. So for example, I can communicate something in a picture, or giving a thumbs up. There's a lot of ways I can express meaning. Gestures, yes, a lot of ways to express meaning. We want to communicate meaningful things, and we want to use this language to and the students don't have to say something in the language. The students can communicate with thumbs up, and if they're just comprehending the very, very beginning,
So, interpretation of meaning, what are we talking about?
Understanding.
So it's the stuff that goes in. So if it's the pictures, it could be reading, it could be listening, listening to a conversation, yeah. So interpretation of meaning is the input part, right? So we have the output part and we have the input part. The tricky one is the next one, which is negotiation of meaning. So how about talk about that? I'll give you a little more time for this one and think through it. Brave volunteer for negotiation of meaning.
Making sure you're being understood.
Everybody hear that? Anything else? Examples? I guess I just did an example, yeah. Making sure you're understood. Did you guys hear that? Right? Yeah. Negotiating the meaning, making sure you guys heard and understood what she was saying. Yeah. So the negotiation of meaning is referring to that natural back and forth when we're really focused on. What's your first name? Sorry.
Ugo.
Ugo. Oh, you're Ugo. Good to meet you. What Ugo said, yeah, when he said things have to be meaningful, right? So the negotiation of meaning is when we are establishing that we understand what that other person is saying and that other person is understanding us. So we do it all the time. Doesn't matter what language we're speaking. If you don't hear somebody, you go, huh? Yeah, that's negotiation of meaning. If you're not quite sure, but you think you understand, you might say, were you saying that, da-da-da-da-da, and the other person responds, oh, yeah. Or no, that's not what I was saying. It's this other thing. So that negotiation of meaning is the back and forth. So remember that I said that I used this definition to inform what I was doing in the classroom and how it really was really impactful on my teaching. I'm going to give you an example of how it changed what I was doing. So had someone asked me before, are you using communicative language teaching? And I said, yes, my students are talking to each other all the time. So they come in Monday morning and I say, turn to your partner and tell your partner 3 things you did over the weekend, and they were talking to each other, right? But were they really communicating? That's the question. And the piece that was missing was this negotiation of meaning. Because if I had a conversation, or if they had a conversation with each other, and I'm going to use read, when pick on read. So, and I said, okay, turn to your partner and tell you 3 things you did over the weekend. I would turn to my partner and I'd say, I prepared for a presentation, I cleaned my house, and I went to Costco. And he would have said,
I woke up, I swept the floor, and I made a list of things to do.
okay, all right. And that would have been it. And they would have turned to the front and been like, okay, what's next, right? So were they truly communicating? If we look at this definition, were they expressing meaning?
Yes.
Yeah. Were they interpreting meaning? Yeah. Most of the time, my students are probably not. I know that when I was talking, Reed was probably already thinking, "What am I going to say?" Right? So he probably wasn't listening to me, and I was already done, so I didn't really care what he said. So there was no negotiation of meaning happening, and this is teaching, you guys all know this, teaching is a process, and you learn more and you learn more and you learn more and you get better and you get more skilled. So this is already, my 9th year of teaching, and when I realized this, yeah. So I realized oh, there's still more that I can do, right, to improve what I'm doing. And so here's the piece that I learned that I could add, and it was just a small shift. Instead of saying, tell your students tell your partner 3 things you did over the weekend, I said, tell your partner 3 things, talk to your partner and come to a consensus. What are 3 things that you did in common over the weekend? And so now I say, okay, Reed, did you go to Costco?
Not this weekend.
Okay. Did you eat dinner out?
Yes.
Oh,
Did you eat dinner? Oh, cool.
Yeah, okay, so there's 1, right? Okay. And so on and so forth, yeah. So it changed, yeah. It changed because we now have that negotiation of meaning. I have to focus on what he says, and he has to focus on what I'm saying. There is much more to this definition, or not to the definition, but there's much more to this than just this piece. But this is one piece, and I would encourage you to learn more. And like I said, that book that BBP put out is excellent to really make you think about these things and help you explore this a little bit further. The last piece of this definition that we're going to talk about is the context, yeah? So quick conversation with your partner about what are we talking about when we say that communication is all of these things in a given context. Go. Okay, so context, so what are we talking about? We're talking about context.
One thing we could be talking about is the given situation. For example, in Spanish, and I know in Japanese,
there's an informal and a formal register.
Mhm.
So I know it's difficult, you can get the kids using the informal register, but then it's really difficult to get them to use the formal register with me, for example. And even though I correct them every time and I try to explain it to them, it still doesn't connect because there's no English equivalent.
Okay, so there's that, and also, when you're doing this, where are you?
You're in the classroom.
You're in the classroom, right? So there's only one.
There's only one time they have to use it.
There's only one like real circumstance in which that actually makes sense to do the formal versus the informal, because you're the only person really of authority, and everybody else is peers. Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's what we over here. Anybody else? So context is kind of there's similarities to what you're saying. So we all have different contexts where we use language, no matter whether it's our first language or second language. But as language teachers, and when we're thinking about this definition, this is our context, yeah? We're in the classroom, and it's very rare that we're gonna have opportunities to really get outside of that context. And so the piece to this, this part of the definition, to me, it's a little bit of a sticky subject, because there's kind of a range, yeah? And some people are really far on one side, whereas other people are really far on the other side. And what I'm saying is that according to this definition and some people's interpretation, is that when you're in a classroom, that's the only context, and there's no way that you can take yourself out of that context. So you need to be thoughtful and purposeful in your, in designing your lessons so that it makes sense within a classroom. Then there's this other side that is like, well, we can change the classroom, and we can turn it into a bank, or we can turn it into a store, or we can turn it into these other things. But the other side would argue that, but if you do that, it's no longer a real context, it's got pretend. And if we're just pretending, then are we truly communicating? So it's a range, and I think I fall a little bit somewhere in the middle where I can see both sides, and I do see value in either way. But I can tell you this from my own personal experience, that I tend to work on the side where I remain in the classroom context and I don't pretend in my classroom. So what I do, I don't pretend that the classroom is someplace else. So what I do is I do things that work in a classroom. So we do things like we do a lot of reading, because that's what students do when they're in school, right? They do a lot of reading. We talk a lot because that's what students do. We talk about a lot of things. But the types of things that we talk about are things that are relevant and make sense in the classroom. So we'll talk about art, we'll talk about history, we'll talk about social studies, we'll talk about current events, we'll talk about what did you do last night, oh, you got your hair cut, things like that because we're all in this classroom together. So there is a range, and it's not part of the definition that I try to go too much in depth with, but it's something that you'll encounter as you start to explore more about this definition. So that's the definition. Can you see how this could be used to inform what you do in the classroom? So I come back to this. So every time I prepare a lesson, I come back to this definition and I say, are my students truly communicating, or am I just forcing them to do something maybe that they don't want to do, or am I just having them practice language? If it has the expression, interpretation, and negotiation of meaning, then it truly can be communicative. So that's part of why we're here today. Also, I wanted to share with you that communication, remember going back to that goal of, what's our goal? Communication is also the primary goal of the actual standards. So even though there are 5 C's here, the idea is that everything is taking place right here. So as we're learning about culture, or our students are learning about culture, they're learning about culture in the language, yeah? It's part of it. It's not a separate thing. So we're not teaching culture in English and then doing other stuff in the target language. We're actually teaching about culture in the target language. We're making these connections in the target language. We're making these comparisons in the target language. And we're building these communities or participating in these communities in the target language. So that goal of communication is the biggest goal that there is when we look at the actual standards. Also for Hawaii Content and Performance Standards, I didn't put it up here, but also there are 2 goals. The first goal and the main goal is communication. The second goal is culture. So it doesn't really matter where we're looking, communication is the goal. So if the goal is communication, then what do we need to do? We need to provide lots and lots and lots and lots of input and interaction. Going back to how our second language is acquired, they're acquired through this, yeah? They're acquired when we're communicating, where students can understand, use the language, and negotiate meaning in the language. So, I found this graphic, and I really like this graphic. It's from SpanishMama.com. But communication starts with comprehensible input. So this is kind of a graphic for comprehensible input. So here's the comprehensible input, and we're pouring it over. Those are students, yeah? So it's got to be meaningful communication in the target language, which leads to acquisition, and then that's how our students grow in proficiency. And I'll put this whole thing in the folder so you guys have access to it. But I wanted to give credit to this person who made this graphic. So for those of you who don't know, this is Dr. Stephen Krashen. He is Professor Emeritus at University of Southern California. He has been around for a very, very long time. He's done a lot of work, and he's he's very well known for his work in second language acquisition and also in regards to input. So I wanted to just share this video with you if you haven't seen it before. It's about 15 minutes, but I really think that he does a good job of demonstrating what I'm talking about when I talk about comprehensible input. So. Going back to the video, some of you are asking, like, when was that video created? When was it filmed? And it's old, right? So what we're talking about today is nothing new. It's just that it's taken a really long time for this information to filter down and get to the point where we're able to understand it and then apply it in a way that works in the classroom. But I wanted to share what ACTFL says about comprehensible input and about language learning. So over here we see Krashen, this is 1982. Learners can only acquire or internalize language when they hear large quantities of input. So that's 1982. 1986, learners acquire language through meaning making with others. And then down here in 1991, 1995, when learners hear large amounts of comprehensible input and are engaged in meaning making, they understand what they hear and they use it to form their own messages. And there's actually a paper on here, we're going to go over this a little bit later, but there's a green paper on there that was written in 1967. And so this like study of second language acquisition really started pre-1970s or very early 1970s. So this isn't really new information. So I want to just pause and talk about this a little bit because I think that this is really, really important when you're thinking about how you're going to teach in the classroom. So I want to talk a little bit about what the difference is between acquisition and learning. Okay, so if you could just take a moment, turn to a partner, and just have a little discussion. When we're talking about second language acquisition, what does that word acquisition really mean as opposed to language in the classroom? Okay, in the classroom context. So go ahead and have a quick chat about the difference between All right, what do you guys talk about? Do you want to share acquisition and learning?
I was sharing my story that I was telling them that for me the difference would be that my minor in college is French. I took 3 years of French, 3 times a week for 3 years. I'm supposed to be fluent in French, but I never acquired the language. I remember some stuff I can go by, but never had that acquiring of all what I've learned.
Yeah. Yep. So that's a good example. Actually, my son, I was just telling somebody else, I was telling Google this outside. My son yesterday, we were driving in the car and we were listening to music in Spanish, and it was his music. It was my music too, but it was his iPod. And he was singing along, and I was like, and my son is not fluent in Spanish. And I said, wow, you know all the words to this? And he's like, yeah. And I was like, well, do you know what you're saying? And he's like, no. Like, you have no clue. He's like, no. But you can say every single word. So he learned the song, but he didn't acquire the language. Yeah.
When I was in high school, my first foreign language was German. And so I was, in the classroom trying to learn it, with the books and doing the exercises, and it was very hard. And I'm like, well, I think the only way I can, master this language is actually to move into the country learning there. So I moved there, I lived there for 3 years, and then I acquired it that way.
Yeah.
So, that's the difference for me.
Yeah. So going back to that definition, you had to really truly communicate in the language with a meaningful purpose, and then that's where you're able to actually acquire it. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, go ahead.
I kind of lean towards the learning, because that's how I learned French. So for me, it's very comfortable to go back and say, okay,
And study.
I know I said it correctly because
Oh,
of the
yeah.
grammar rules or whatever.
So in your mind, you go back and,
Yeah, so for
Evaluate
me,
yourself.
it would be easier to learn first and then try to apply.
interesting.
So
Okay.
Gina, we were saying, like I was trying to formulate or understand what the difference was because I don't remember. But we're like, was acquisition long-term? But if that sense of your son, that example, he can still remember those lyrics later. Like I
probably
can
way
remember
later.
Hawaiian songs that I grew up singing, but I still don't know what they mean. So then, in that sense, acquisition is not long-term. So it's, what would it, are you gonna explain it now?
Yeah, well,
I mean, I'll go over it, but yeah, that's a good example though too, right?
okay, so this is basically when we're talking about in the classroom, this is the difference. So when we're talking about second language acquisition, we're talking about the implicit or unconscious process of getting the language into your brain. So remember what Krashen said about when you're so engaged in a conversation that you forget you're speaking the language. Yeah, that is when the acquisition is happening, versus learning, which is an explicit or conscious process. So when I was teaching my students all the grammar endings, I was using the language, but I was teaching them about the language, and then they were consciously paying attention to, okay, this word means this, and this word means that, and this is how you change this word to make it into this or that, right? So it's a conscious process where they're thinking about the language instead of thinking in the language, yeah. The other difference that I think is important to point out is that the data is the input. So input is grammar and vocabulary that are used in context. Whereas when we're talking about learning, learning is often very output-oriented, where vocabulary and grammar is taught, and then it's either practiced or memorized. And I guess that's the same thing like with the song example and that as well. When we're talking about acquiring language, the focus is on the meaning, it's on the message and what's actually being said. And at least for the first couple of years, what I really try to get across to people when I'm sharing this is that output is not the main focus for the first couple of years. The main focus has to be on what's coming in, because it takes time for that to be processed and then produce the output. Does that mean students aren't talking in my classes? They're talking all the time. Yeah, it's a very noisy, loud classroom, but it's not really truly output that you're hearing for a while. Yeah, because it can't be. It's got to be in the brain before it can be able to be processed and brought back out in a real and meaningful, what is truly being communicative. So I just want to point this out because I want you to like really understand when we're talking about acquisition, second language acquisition, it's very, very different from learning. Yeah. All right, I don't know if that answers your question, Kate, or not, but I think that they could both be long-term,
memorization.
Right? Huh?
Performance versus memorization.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, basically, yeah. We're talking about proficiency. Yeah. This is gonna lead to being proficient in the language, yeah. This could be performance, yeah. Maybe. Okay. All right. ACTFL also has what is called 6 core practices. And I like to talk about this because when we're talking about providing input in the classroom, I've come across some things this year that have been pretty eye-opening for me. Maybe not surprising, but it made me realize that there's a need to talk about this. So in their 6 core practices, the very first practice that they have is facilitate target language comprehensibility. And then underneath it says, students and teachers speak, listen, read, write, view, and create in the target language 90% or more during class time. And then they cite comprehensible input, context, and interactions. So, so I really focused in on this year as I was providing professional development for teachers across the state, because I started to realize that this is a real big challenge. And this was my challenge, right? Remember back my first 2 years of teaching, at the end of the year, I hardly used Spanish at all because it was hard. It was really, really hard to use the target language. And that was partially because, maybe mostly because of the way that I was teaching. I was teaching for learning. I wasn't teaching for acquisition of the language. I was teaching about it. And so, so I couldn't speak to the students 90% of the time in the language because they couldn't understand what I was saying. So I actually did some polls this year with teachers because I wanted to know how much are teachers actually using the target language in class. And so what I'd like for you to do is I'd like for you to get your phones back out, go back to Menti, and let's just see where you folks are with the use of the target language in the classroom. So do a little self-reflection. Try and honestly think in the classroom when you're teaching, what % of the time are you using the target language in your instruction? So, you know, nice round number, like, you know, not like 38.6 or something like that. All right, so I just want to share with you where I was at when I started and where I was at when I ended with my teaching. So when I first started in 2006, the first day I probably spoke a lot of Spanish, but they probably didn't understand anything I was saying. And by the last day of school, I probably was not speaking any Spanish, or, you know, it was probably just hola, and that was it. So I was very much not using the target language. And then when I started using TPRS, it got better. It went up, but I was still probably in this like 50% range for a while. And then it wasn't until probably about the last 4 years of teaching that I was up in this 90% plus range. A lot of days I didn't, it was 100%. But it took a lot of work and change in my teaching to get to that point, to be able to use the target language in a comprehensible way, right? Where most of the students were understanding most of what I was saying most of the time. Because prior to that, maybe when I was using it, they weren't even really understanding. So it's not just that you use the language 90%, but that you use it and the students are understanding what you're saying. The goal is for them to understand everything that you say, but it takes time to get to that place. So hopefully, you know, in the next few years, we'll see this number get bigger and bigger, and if we have more presentations later on, maybe next summer, if we do this again, maybe we'll do this again and we can see this grow, I hope. So the next question on here is, what are the challenges? Like, what are the challenges that you face? I just want to have everybody share out a little bit. So, motivation. Motivation as a student or motivation for you? That's my question. Both? Okay, students. How many would say motivation of the students? Okay, and then how many would say your own motivation? Not as many, so more students, but okay. All right, so lots of stuff up here, and this is all so true. Time, okay? So if you're trying to teach a bunch of stuff, yeah, if you have this curriculum that you're trying to get through, you're trying to get through a book, yeah, you're not going to be able to do it because there's not going to be enough time. Behavior, students check out. I see lots of stuff about like blank stares, students check out, resistance from students, comprehension, they're not able to understand, student engagement. So I see a lot of stuff about that, yeah. Not enough TPRS skills, or I would even change that to CI skills, yeah. Planning, stamina. Okay, there's a big one. So you guys are all going to have the chance today to be in a class where you're going to learn another language that you don't know. Yeah, you're going to learn a little bit, and so you're gonna get to experience the student side of this. There was one up here. Which one was it? It was like speaking too fast. I don't know where it went, but there was one that said speaking too fast. You're gonna get this experience today where you're gonna be like, oh my gosh, I have to slow down because my students are going too fast for my students. That's a really, really, really difficult thing to learn and change. Lots of good information up here, and you know, all of it's true. Yeah, it's hard, and it's hard to overcome some of these challenges. But I can tell you from my own experience that it can be done. Yeah, it can definitely be done. All right. So getting back to our presentation. Thank you for sharing all of that. All right, so I'm going to start kind of wrapping things up here. The title of this conference is CCLT. And so hopefully you have a good understanding now what CCLT is. It stands for Comprehension-based Communicative Language Teaching. So we talked about what communicative language teaching is, and we also talked about comprehensible input, basically a collection of principles and practices that combine comprehensible input with communicative language teaching, basically is what we're talking about here. And that within this CCLT, that definition of communication informs instruction. So using that definition as a working definition that you refer to as you're planning lessons and you're doing things in the classroom can be very, very useful. And that communication is both the vehicle and the goal of instruction. So we're not just saying we want students to be able to communicate, but we're using the language, we're using the target language as the vehicle to get the students to be able to communicate in the language. Some of the strategies that you're going to be learning about today include card talk, circling. Circling is kind of the basis of everything when it comes to this kind of stuff. And then movie talk tomorrow. Reading and literacy is going to be sprinkled throughout, so you'll get to learn how reading and literacy is included in this. A strategy called one-word image. You'll be able to see how TPR is incorporated into CCLT, and then TPRS, among other things. So, and the great thing is that there are going to be 3 different languages you're going to be, or 3 different instruction going on today with 3 different languages. And you'll get the opportunity to meet everybody between today and tomorrow. You'll cycle through all of the instructors or coaches between today and tomorrow. So if you could take a moment, I want to just have you, that little green sheet, the half green sheet, I want you to read through that as we're closing up today, and then have a couple minute discussion with somebody close to you. This was written in 1967. And I feel like it rings so true today.
I have a question, maybe, not so much a comment. I'm a lecturer, and so my students are adults. And it's an entirely different situation when dealing with someone who has come up in a system that is already fixed in their mind, like, you're the teacher, you tell me what I need to know. I don't have any say in this, so why start now? So if I were to go to my first class, I think, and ask, oh, there's no syllabus, or rather it's, student driven, what interests you? What do you consider fun? Let's go down that path. I'm sure they would all stare at me like, what are you on? I'm going to go to this other person's class because that seems way easier than whatever you think I'm going to do for you. Rather, sort of this approach of, I'm paying you as the teacher to teach me, so why do I have to come up with this? So I guess my question would be, how do you present this idea in such a way that inspires rather than seems daunting and overwhelming to people who have already learned for 12, 15 years that this isn't the norm, this is the system?
I have my own thoughts, but I'd love to hear if anybody else out there wants to respond.
It is nice to have a spine with a textbook, I think, and then it is easy for us even a teacher to follow. Like, I think this one is a little bit more saying facilitate the situation, to use the language. But I totally get that because I would have like over 30 kids in the class, and then some are even not there to learn.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, it is kind of easier to manage. Give a worksheet, do it, give a point,
it is
you get a grade. So it is really, I know it's gonna work, I think, and like you said.
It's very much stepping outside of your comfort zone, and it is, like you said, it's stepping outside of the comfort zone of our students sometimes, in situations
and
like
they're
that.
also trained to do a worksheet. As soon as they receive a worksheet, they just start doing it, even without listening to the worksheet.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Anybody else want to respond to the?
I would start with the TPRS. that would be my first thing to do. Because when Blaine Ray came several years ago and I went to his presentation, and he just started, and he did it in German, and we just, went along with him, and then when he said, write as much as you can in the story, and I just kept writing and writing and writing, I just was like, I cannot believe how much I can write. It was shocking to me. And when they have that feeling, that initial feeling of, how did she do that? Because that's why I was like, how did he do that? And I think you do that for them, and they realize that that is a way, a legitimate way to learn language. And then you explain to them, this course requires your interaction with me. It's not a traditional sit and get course, but you will learn. But it's going to take a different kind of effort from you. But I think you start with a demonstration that will help them to understand what you're doing.
Yeah. There's also something else.
I don't know whether now would be a moment for a short anecdote to reply to the first one.
Go ahead.
Would you like that? Yeah. I'm probably the oldest person in the room, and I've been teaching for I had a class, I did quite a lot of training in England. I'm Australian, but I did a lot of training in England under a lot of very interesting people, and we looked at Krashen and all sorts of things. And I went back then to my classes at the University of Zurich with revolutionary ideas, brimming with all this sort of wonderful input and how I could do it. And I literally hit a brick wall because they were expecting exactly what you'd experienced and expressed. So I thought, well, in the wise words of one of my teachers, Adrian Underhill, who's an absolute guru on pronunciation, I thought, okay, so I've come almost as if I've come from Mars and I've landed back in Zurich. How am I going to get the people who are over there expecting me to do grammar translation methodology, and this is back in the 70s, grammar translation methodology, how am I going to get round this? So I thought, well, thinking about Adrian's words, I'm here, they're there, I want them over here, but I've got to go back to them, and I've got to slowly bring them over. And with a good example of that was also in adult education in Zurich with all these wonderful ideas. I had a group of mature learners, shall we say, who have definitely, all came with their backpacks of how they'd been learning in their previous experience. And I was so bored with this sort of 18-week semester and doing books. So I said to them, look, how about if we try something really new? And they sort of said yes. I said, well, let's just brainstorm all the areas, all the contexts that you're interested in, and let's find some common things for you to work on. And this is way before the ideas of task-based learning, teaching, or anything like that. And we got into project-based learning. And that absolutely exploded their participation. It was quite amazing. And it was just taking the ideas, well, you give me the ideas, and I'll bring in some material and we'll work on those ideas. This is sort of intermediate level, CFR level, probably B2 upwards, not completely.
These are all great ideas, and thank you so much for sharing that, especially because that's like back from like the 70s. That's awesome, I can just respond. I have my own thoughts about it, and I would bring it back to what's the goal. Why are you here? What's your goal? Do you want to learn the language? Do you want to be able to communicate with the language, or do you want to learn about the language? Because there's two different things. And what I personally do with my students, and I know that it's not college, it's high school, but I am constantly showing them my amazement at, oh my gosh, did you hear what she just said? She just said that all in Spanish, and that was, and I just bring that amazement back of that, can you believe where you're at? Can you believe where we're going? And constantly, just sharing that every single day, to keep that, that motivation and keep that understanding that they are learning. Because after a while, when you use this method, after a while, students start to feel like, am I even learning anything? They don't even realize that they're acquiring language, because it's not that it's easy, but it's not as it's not studying. Yeah, it's different from studying. You know, it's effortful, it's engaged, they have to be, you know, that, but as long as you can keep that going, the learning just, you know, the acquisition keeps happening. So I would take it back to the goal, but yeah, and you know, like Leslie mentioned, you know, starting out with, you know, something that's in the, you know, in the target language that first day to get that buy-in definitely helps. And I'm going to share about that in one of my sessions later about how I start my first 3 days of teaching.
So I guess the real challenge is creating those conditions,
Yeah.
you know, so they can develop whatever that's saying over there. That's our real challenge as teachers, as lecturers, you know, as instructors.
Yeah. And can you believe this was written in 1967? I mean, this is like so like right now. You know, when I read this, it blows me away. So this whole article is in the folder, the Google Drive folder. I put the link to the article. I think I just made a PDF and put it in there. The whole article, definitely worth a read, and keeping in mind that wow, this was a long time ago. And what he says in here, you know, until we learn more about the way a learner learns and what his built-in syllabus is, we've learned a lot of that now. Yeah, since 1967, we've learned a lot, and we know about acquisition. Oh, sorry. Thank you.
I have a question. How have some of us gotten the administration on board for this kind of approach? Because ultimately I see that goes back to assessment and what we're held accountable.
Yeah, and that's a really big question that I've addressed all year long with teachers. What school are you with?
Here at UH.
You're here at UH. So, I know it's a tough one. You know, for me, I'm just going to say for me personally, because you know, I don't have like all of the answer, but for me personally, what really, really helped is when I was able to back up what I was doing with, you know, what the research says, what, you know, and be able to answer all of those hard questions that the administrators might ask. When I was able to respond to those things, that really helped with being able to get that buy-in. The thing that we have to remember is that we are the experts. We're the language teachers. We're the ones who know about languages. And so if we know how languages are acquired and if communication is our goal, you know, and acquisition is our goal, then we're the ones who have to dictate what that's going to be. You know, and I know, you know, university level is a whole different thing, and I would think that university would be so much further along than high school or you know, K-12, but it feels like K-12 is where a lot of more of the innovative things are happening, and maybe that's because, I don't know why that would be, but anyway, so my answer is just, you know, if you can learn everything and back up what you're saying and being able to talk to that, it really helps a lot. But anybody else from university have any ideas or suggestions?
I was just going to say put performance-based, have more of a performance or task-based syllabus instead of a vocabulary-based syllabus or a grammar-based syllabus. So what you're saying to students at the beginning is, here's the printout, these are the goals for the entire year, and you know, by the end of this unit, you'll be able to, at a minimum, greet people or say some things about yourself to someone else. By the end of Unit 2, on this date, you'll be able to do something with food, do something with transportation. You decide what those are, and that doesn't limit you to those things. It just means that at a minimum they can do that, and then maybe they can do 10 other things too. So don't let those assessments limit, like we just have to train for the test. But you can have a can-do statement at the beginning of each unit where you say, by the end of this unit, you'll be able to do these things, you know, in whatever context, to communicate what you need to communicate. And then you can have really open and free discussions during class that happen to include the things that they need. It's going to have the language that they're going to need for it, the exact words, the exact grammar. That's going to be in their input from you. But you know, you can, if the task is going to be at the end of the unit, you can go to a bank and open a checking account. Maybe that would be a more advanced thing. That you can also, you know, you can make up stories about fictional characters who go to the bank. You can ask students about their real experience going to the bank. You can tell a real story about yourself and a problem you had at the bank. There's a lot of opportunities for input and interaction, and some of them could be about some fantastical adventure, and there's a bank in one part of it. You don't have to totally limit yourself to what that is, but essentially they're getting all the language they need, so when that assessment comes up at the end, they do the little performance. You could also do something free and open-ended and say, write me a story about whatever you want, and then they can show off everything else they know. So there are concrete things you can put in a syllabus that we can work towards.
And Donna Clementi came to Ilani School, my Ilani colleagues remember. So that question came up as well. She represents ACPL and she goes around to different schools to talk about ACPL standards. And when that question came up, she says that don't jump off the cliff by yourself because you could risk losing your job. And she said that if you want change has to happen slowly. If you can slowly get more colleagues on board and more people to support you and buy in, then that could slowly go up the ladder to administration.
That's kind of what my experience was.
And then at the university level, the NFLRC here, they have workshops where university instructors share about project-based language learning and how they get their students into the community and then build a portfolio from there. Assessment is from the project and the language that they learn and helping the community. So there's a lot of resources here.
Yeah. I think somebody else.
I was just gonna say, like you said, we're the experts in the classroom and we're knowledgeable about how languages are acquired, so it's up to us to educate our admin. If they're not, I mean, maybe they were a former classroom teacher, maybe they're not, but what are the chances that they were a foreign language teacher? So we have to show them, you can invite them into our classrooms and say, hey, come check it out, what it is I'm doing, and show how you're meeting the standards at the same time. But spelling it out for them and opening those discussions with your admin and letting them know why you're doing these changes.
I know when Papu High School, the whole language department decided to really focus on CCLT. Anyone from Papu want to share about what happened with admin?
So our department head, Will, got all of our thoughts together and he actually educated our administrators. And we have an administrator that works with our department. So she comes in, she knows what's going on. And then also Keith is such a fantastic administrator for our high school. And so he actually paid for all of us to come here. And so he's like, what do you guys need? What are you doing? And so he had a talk story session like, come meet the principal. What's going on in your department? What's new? Kevin got to teach him what's new. And so he actually instructed Hayashi, yeah?
You did a little.
Yeah, he did a little. Because all the administrators and all teachers have learned another language in high school and in college, but we're here to tell them it's not like that. You know, what we're doing now is not like how you learn it, because everyone has the same thing like, oh, I took like 3 years, I don't know how to say anything in Japanese, I don't know how to do it. So we're kind of giving them a mind shift, yeah? And so we decided as an entire department, okay, let's shift our pacing calendar. And all level 1, let's just all teach thematically and do this. So we're sort of in the baby steps of that. But yeah, it is a team approach.
Yeah, it certainly helps. Okay, all right. Okay, so any other comments? Okay, all right. So my last thing to you is take a leap of faith. Yeah, try one thing. So with what you learned at this conference, you're going to learn a lot. And even if you already know a lot, you're going to learn a lot more because you're going to be able to be with many different coaches that are going to share things that, I mean, I'm learning from them all the time, which is really exciting. And do it.